Here begins a long tale of shifting allegiances and quiet loyalties, of the fragile balance between honor and ambition that shaped the North and all Westeros. In this reimagining of events, House Bolton never broke faith with House Stark. Instead of turning treacherous blades upon the very kingdom they were meant to uphold, they held fast to oaths sworn in the old god's name. Without open betrayal, the North might chart a different course through the storms of the War of the Five Kings and beyond. Let us see how that future unfolds. When Robb Stark was proclaimed king in the North after Ned Stark's execution in King's Landing, the lords of the North gathered beneath his direwolf banner. The great hall of Riverrun, seat of House Tully, hummed with murmured pledges, sharpened steel, and the heady rush of newly stoked vengeance. Present among the kneeling nobles was Roose Bolton, the lord of the Dreadfort, a man of pale eyes and a voice that seldom rose above a whisper. Yet in this new telling of events, his words did not carry hidden daggers. He swore his loyalty openly, bowing with a measured courtesy to the young king. His face unreadable, but his oath as firm as the next man's. Many who had known the Boltons only from ancient tales of flaying knives and cunning cruelty still felt the old chill in the air around Roose. But in this story, the chill was a remnant of rumor, not an omen of betrayal. Robb Stark, weary-eyed but newly minted as king in the North, accepted Roose's oath with a solemn nod. Though the future king had small reason to doubt the man, Roose had served loyally alongside his father, Eddard, during the Greyjoy Rebellion. There was a faint shadow in his heart. Perhaps it was the heritage of House Bolton, or the faint sense that Roose Bolton's presence was always that of a figure half in the dark. But any fleeting reservations were buried beneath the weight of Northern unity. War had come, and if the North was to have any chance, it needed all its bannermen united under one purpose. "It is decided, then," declared Robb, his voice carrying through the hall. "For too long, the Iron Throne has stained itself with our blood. They took my father from us. They would make us kneel. But the North will never forget." He glanced about, meeting the eyes of each lord he trusted. "And I will never forget those who stand true beside me in this fight." Not long after, the Northern army marshaled at Riverrun, forging a plan to strike back against the Lannisters. News spread of Tywin Lannister's forces in the field, of Jaime Lannister's capture by the young wolf, and the precarious lines that stretched across the riverlands. Every northern lord had a task. The Umbers guarded the path to Moat Cailin, the Manderleys lent their fleets and coin, and Roose Bolton was entrusted with a contingent of his own men to hold key crossings in the riverlands. In that moment, the king in the North believed in solidarity. If the Boltons had conceived any plan for subterfuge, it would have been easy enough to misdirect scattered outriders, or to feed intelligence to the enemy. But in this retelling, Roose offered no such treachery. Instead, he reported regularly, followed orders to the letter, and, to Robb's cautious relief, delivered victories. At the onset of the campaign, Roose's stewardship in the Riverlands garnered grudging respect from other lords. A man with a quiet disposition but a calculated mind, Roose Bolton was not the sort to rally men with stirring speeches. Instead, he provided calm leadership. His men marched in disciplined ranks. They looted less than some of the other northern bannermen, and rumors of flaying or excessive cruelty were absent. His skill at placing scouts and forging alliances with local riverlords earned him the fleeting admiration of the likes of Edmure Tully, who privately thought him formidable in all the right ways. And though Edmure was uneasy about the house's gruesome reputation, he found no fault with the manner in which Bolton executed his orders. In the North, those who remained behind recognized that open war and winter made for a dangerous combination. Lady Catelyn Stark traveled with Robb, but Bran and Rickon stayed in Winterfell, entrusted to the watch of Maester Luwin, Ser Roderick Castle, and a skeleton garrison. The dire wolves roamed the grounds, uneasy at the absence of their older brother's presence, howling occasionally by the gates as if awaiting a returning host that might not come for months. The ravens brought messages from King Robb about his early successes, about alliances with the Freys, albeit an uneasy arrangement, and occasionally about lesser lords or hedge knights who swore fealty. Amid that swirl of news, no letter arrived with warnings that House Bolton might be a threat. Perhaps that was the greatest solace. No secret reports, no signs of duplicity. The Boltons, it seemed, were content with their role. Yet war is seldom so simple as to hinge upon one man's loyalty alone. The War of the Five Kings expanded like a storm across the continent. Up north, Balon Greyjoy crowned himself king of the Iron Islands and launched his own invasion of the north, seizing the chance while Robb's armies were in the south. Deep in the Westerlands, Tywin Lannister consolidated his power, even as his son Jaime languished in a makeshift cell under the watchful eyes of the northern soldiers. Meanwhile, Stannis Baratheon made his dark claims on Dragonstone, and Renly Baratheon pulled the Reach behind him. Amid it all, the North found itself at once united in declared independence and threatened on every side. In this version of events, the moment that might have tempted Roose Bolton into treachery, a secret promise from the Lannisters or an alliance with Walder Frey, never came to fruition. Tywin Lannister was too proud and too assured of House Bolton's rumored duplicity to extend a genuine offer that might sway them. Walder Frey, though cunning, still seethed with resentment at Robb's broken engagement to one of his daughters, but he made no secret arrangements with the Dreadfort. Instead, the Freys reached out to Tywin directly, planting seeds for what they hoped would be their own advantage. This left Bolton in place, apparently unapproached and uncorrupted. And so the North's most infamous banner remained, ironically enough, one of its stalwarts. Meanwhile, in the Dreadfort's halls, a different sort of tension brewed. Ramsay Snow, Roose's bastard son, had often harbored a streak of cruelty that matched the darkest rumors of House Bolton. With his father gone to war, he lingered at home, pacing the ancient corridors, entertaining himself with hawking and hunts. Servants whispered that Ramsay was an ill-tempered and unpredictable man, prone to amusements that left small animals maimed or servants trembling. There was no shortage of fear in the Dreadfort, but with Roose's instructions that the region be kept orderly for the good of the North, even Ramsay found himself curbed. The bastard of Bolton could not indulge in his darkest impulses as freely as he might have if his father saw advantage in sowing terror. Instead, the watchful eyes of men loyal to Roose kept Ramsay in check, or at least as best they could. The uneasy quiet in the Dreadfort was a small ripple in the larger ocean of war, but in future days, it would become relevant indeed. Far to the south, King Robb Stark pressed his advantage. The armies under his command split, forging pincer movements against the Lannisters. Roose Bolton was tasked with marching eastward toward Harrenhal. In canon, his path to Harrenhal would have spelled uneasy alliances and potential betrayals. But in our version of events, the men of the Dreadfort served as dutiful vanguards, capturing lesser Lannister fortifications along the way, using cunning, not betrayal, to break enemy lines. Lord Bolton's reputation for swift, silent maneuvers, supported by men who neither boasted nor broke ranks, allowed him to seize Harrenhal with minimal bloodshed after Gregor Clegane's brutal raids had left the fortress undermanned and demoralized. Capturing it was no easy feat, but they did so without the betrayal that, in another timeline, had carved a bloody path for House Bolton's ascendance. Inside Harrenhal's accursed halls, Roose established his seat of command. The fortress was notoriously difficult to hold and rumored to be haunted by the curses of Harren the Black. Yet Roose, ever the pragmatist, declared the castle strategic for controlling the Trident's Crossing. He left enough men to garrison it, Northmen who proved disciplined under his leadership, and continued to coordinate with Robb Stark through ravens. Prisoners taken in the field were brought to Harrenhal for questioning, and some black cells were filled with lesser knights who refused to give up Lannister secrets. Roose's men reported that he used chilling but methodical interrogation methods. A Bolton's presence alone often coaxed enough from captives to be useful. However, actual flayings or atrocities remained minimal, frightening illusions more than verified truths. Catelyn Stark, uneasy with the entire conflict, traveled at times to Harrenhal. She engaged Roose Bolton in conversation, searching for any hidden designs. She had known him little in the days of Eddard's rule, though she recognized that Ned had once spoken of Roose as a man who gets results but seldom stirs hearts. Now, with her beloved Ned gone, her sons scattered, and her homeland threatened, she found the Lord of the Dreadfort paradoxically reassuring. He was not warm, nor was he comforting in the manner of a friend, but he was loyal, apparently unshaken by any promise from the enemy. His words were measured, his courtesy impeccable, and though Caitlin could not dispel the ghostly unease that clung to a Bolton's presence, she could not deny that he served her son well. She asked him, in one quiet conversation near the echoing hearth of Harrenhal's great hall, "My lord, do you believe we have a real chance against the Lannisters? They have so many men, so much gold, and so many alliances in the south." Roos's pale eyes flickered across the dancing flames as he replied, "The king in the north is strong, he is clever, and he has the loyalty of the north behind him. Gold cannot buy a man's soul if that soul is committed to family and kin. The Lannisters will try to lure us with illusions of power, but illusions melt away in the face of stubborn resolve." It was perhaps the longest statement she had heard from him since the war began. Caitlin studied him a moment longer, trying to glean any hidden meaning. But if there was anything else behind those words, it remained buried beneath the same calm facade that had accompanied the man into every hall. To the south, Robb Stark fought Tywin's armies in skirmishes, evading the main host whenever possible and focusing on smaller victories to chip away at Lannister morale. One of those conflicts saw the Karstarks, under Rickard Karstark, capture a group of knights who had marched under the banner of the Kingsguard. The tragedy of the Karstark heir's death at Jaime Lannister's hands still weighed heavily upon that house, and Robb worried that Karstark's thirst for vengeance would lead to rash acts. But in this timeline, with Bolton fully loyal, there was an additional voice of calm urging strategic caution. Roose did not appear in person for those deliberations, but ravens bearing his sealed letters arrived, advising Robb to carefully trade highborn prisoners to strengthen their negotiating power. This counsel bolstered Catelyn Stark's repeated pleas. Consequently, the Karstarks reigned in their vengeance, at least for a time, and their captive knights remained bargaining chips for the future. Across the twins, Walder Frey still waited, simmering in resentment. In the canonical story, the betrayal at the Red Wedding would be shaped by a secret arrangement between the Freys, the Boltons, and Tywin Lannister. Yet, in this new tapestry, House Bolton was not seeking an opportunity to become the Warden of the North through betrayal. They had not responded to Frey's quiet inquiries with anything beyond stiff courtesy. Perhaps Walder Frey did not trust Roose Bolton enough, or perhaps he felt the Bolton Lord was too subtle, too deadly, too likely to turn the tables should the terms displease him. Thus, the seeds of betrayal took root differently. Still, Walder Frey's dissatisfaction with Robb Stark, who had married Talisa Maegor instead of a Frey, did not abate. The old lord nursed his grudge, corresponding with Tywin Lannister in secret. At the same time, he tried to entreat other northern lords, those who might be disaffected, overshadowed, or looking for advantage. He found that the Boltons, Umbers, and Manderleys did not respond with willingness. Their loyalty to the Starks was too deeply woven, or so it seemed. Rebuffed, Walder Frey's letters found new destinations. Roose Bolton's mailed courier, a man named Louis Farron, intercepted a suspicious missive from the twins while traveling near Harrenhal. He delivered it to Roose, who read its contents silently. The exact words were never shared, but after scanning the parchment, Lord Bolton sent his own raven to Robb, warning him that Walder Frey was not to be trusted. The king in the north, already shamed by his broken pledge to the Freys, now found justification to keep them at arm's length. He realized that old Walder might be planning something far darker than simply withholding his crossing or cursing Robb's name. Even so, the campaign demanded alliances. Robb deliberated over how best to handle the Freys. Catelyn counseled that it would be unwise to antagonize them further. Edmure Tully still believed the Freys could be placated or, at worst, contained. Roose's warning was heeded, but the war offered no pause for the complicated politics of House Frey. For the moment, Robb contented himself with dispatching small gifts, messages about respect for the crossing, and a promise to mend old wounds at war's end. He hoped it would be enough to forestall any immediate betrayal. Shortly thereafter, the tides of war shifted again. Roose Bolton's hold on Harrenhal was challenged by an unexpected arrival. Tywin Lannister decided to march in force. Unwilling to face Tywin's entire host alone, Bolton began evacuating Harrenhal in measured retreat, leading the bulk of his forces to rejoin King Robb's main host. rather than stand in a fortress that was notoriously difficult to hold against a well-provisioned army. Roose saw advantage in letting Tywin occupy the scorched ruin. It was a hollow prize, lacking farmland and overshadowed by curses, requiring precious manpower to maintain. Tywin had to leave a garrison behind, which split his forces. That maneuver suited the northern cause well. Robb was not idle during these maneuvers. He harried Tywin's supply lines, attacked outriders, and used the terrain to his advantage. The young wolf's reputation grew, and so did the hatred Tywin harbored for him. In parallel, Stannis Baratheon's threat to King's Landing gnawed at Tywin's focus, forcing the Lord of Casterly Rock to consider an abrupt pivot to protect the Iron Throne. Through all of these developments, the loyalty of the Boltons, though it did not ring with the same proud fervor as the Umbers or the Tullis, remained consistent, quiet, and firm. There were no mysterious vanishings of outriders, no coded messages to the Lannisters, no chance for enemy infiltration. Robb's victories were therefore less precarious. The ground beneath him was not riddled with betrayal. Even so, the fortunes of war shifted dramatically in the next act. Word reached the northern camp that Theon Greyjoy, once a ward and companion to Robb Stark, had led an Ironborn force against Winterfell. The capital of the North was seized by betrayal. Bran and Rickon Stark went missing, assumed dead by Theon's men. The shock of it struck Robb like a hammer blow. Suddenly, the king in the north was forced to turn part of his attention back to his homeland. It was not only betrayal by a friend, but the rumored demise of two of his younger brothers. Many in the north cried for vengeance, none more so than the men of House Stark. But with the main northern host deep in the Riverlands, how could Winterfell be reclaimed? In the original history, Roose Bolton would eventually send his bastard son, Ramsay Snow, to retake Winterfell. That chain of events, in its canonical telling, ended in tragedy and horrifying cruelty, culminating in the sacking and partial destruction of Winterfell. Here, the impetus was different and perhaps less overshadowed by hidden agendas. When Robb heard of the fall of Winterfell, Roose Bolton quietly proposed dispatching a force under the command of his captains to the north. "Send my men," he suggested to Robb, voice calm as ever. "I will remain here in the Riverlands with you to ensure we maintain our front against the Lannisters. We can send word to my bastard, Ramsay, that he is to rally a host of Dreadfort men, retake Winterfell from the Ironborn, and hold it until you return." Robb stared at the newly presented plan. Given Theon's betrayal, it made sense that a separate force from the north might more swiftly respond, especially if it did not have to march from the Riverlands. "My mother has gone to treat with Renly Baratheon," Robb said softly, brow furrowed. "I would see Winterfell saved, but I must keep the bulk of our forces in the south to deal with the Lannisters." "Very well. See it done, my lord. Please instruct your men that my brothers, if they yet live, are to be spared from harm at all costs." Roose bowed his head in agreement. In days following, ravens flew north, instructing the Dreadfort's men, including Ramsay Snow, to muster and retake Winterfell from the Ironborn. There was no hidden message to let the bastards run wild, no designs to usurp the seat of House Stark. Instead, the directive was clear: end the occupation. Save the Starks if they were there. Ensure the loyalty of the North. With such orders, Ramsay embarked. Yet, as many a Dreadfort retainer might have whispered, the bastard's nature could not be entirely leashed by letters and paternal command. Ramsay welcomed a chance to show his father his worth, or so he might have told himself. The cruelty that lurked in him simmered beneath the surface, ready for an excuse. When Ramsay arrived near Winterfell, he did so under the banner of the Flayed Man, but with a letter from his father proclaiming that he came in the name of King Robb Stark. Theon Greyjoy's forces were already strained. The Ironborn faced local Northmen uprisings across the coasts, as well as the approach of House Bolton from the east. The tension within Theon's small garrison peaked as the first pink-clad outriders circled the keep, harrying them night and day. Theon, isolated and desperate, wondered if any help would come from Pike. It did not. Yara Greyjoy, hearing of Theon's precarious position, might have considered sending ships, but the hold of the north was tenuous at best. The Ironborn were raiders, not entrenched occupiers, and soon enough, it was clear Theon stood alone. Ramsay Snow's siege on Winterfell began with cunning. He told Theon that if he surrendered, the Ironborn would be permitted to leave. Yet Theon's pride and fear warred in his mind. Would the bastards spare him, or would the Boltons simply flay him alive? Theon had no illusions about House Bolton's brutality, nor about the gossip that Ramsay himself was a vicious whelp. But as days turned into weeks, supplies running low, Theon made a desperate choice. He attempted to slip away with a handful of Ironborn in the dead of night. The watchers posted by Ramsay quickly discovered the attempt, ambushing Theon's party. A short, savage fight ended with Theon captured, his Ironborn men either dead or scattering into the forests. Winterfell was effectively retaken, though not without cost. Ramsay's men found the burned husks of 2 farm boys that had been displayed as the Stark children. Northmen reeled in horror, believing them to be the bodies of Bran and Rickon. Ramsay, cunning enough to suspect that Theon might have lied about the boys' identities, tortured Theon for information. Under duress, Theon babbled half-coherent confessions that the real Stark boys had vanished into the crypts or fled or something along those lines. Theon's mind unraveled under torture, and though Ramsay gleaned the truth, he learned the dead children were not the Stark heirs. He did not announce it widely. Instead, he kept the knowledge to himself, possibly hoping to deliver the living Stark boys later as a means to curry favor with his father or with Robb. The conflicting impulses in Ramsay's mind, ambition, cruelty, a thirst for power, danced in a macabre swirl. But he had no permission to do anything aside from holding Winterfell in King Robb's name. In the days that followed, with Theon secured in a dungeon cell, Ramsay's men patrolled the keep. Some among them saw the battered walls, the scorched timbers, and realized that the old seat of House Stark had suffered grievously in the conflict. Yet Winterfell still stood, albeit partially ruined. Ramsay did not conduct a wholesale sacking. He had orders to keep the seat for the Starks. However, small horrors crept in at the edges. Servants who displeased Ramsay found themselves beaten. A stable boy who reported to have seen shapes in the crypts soon vanished. Ramsay, let off his leash, indulged in intimidation and violence behind closed doors. The instructions from Roose Bolton could only do so much to curb a man's darkest urges, and Winterfell had become a stage upon which Ramsay might practice them discreetly while publicly proclaiming loyalty to King Robb. The difference in this narrative was that his father had not specifically sanctioned atrocities, nor did the Boltons plan on supplanting House Stark. Yet an evil man with limited oversight can still carve his own savage path. Bran and Rickon Stark, hidden in the crypts, emerged days after Theon's downfall, guided by loyal friends. They discovered that the keep was now in Bolton hands, not a safe haven. With Ramsay's reputation preceding him, the Starks and their companions decided to flee. Under cover of darkness, they slipped beyond the walls, avoiding the patrols. They parted ways, Osha, Hodder, and Rickon heading into the wild, while Bran, accompanied by Mira and Jojen Reed, began the journey toward the wall. Unknown to Ramsay, the true Stark boys were out of his grasp. The continued existence of the young heirs of Winterfell would eventually come to light, but for now, many in the north still believed them dead. Meanwhile, as winter's chill deepened in the northern lands, Robb Stark continued the war in the Riverlands. He heard scattered rumors that the Bolton retinue had succeeded in wresting Winterfell from the Ironborn. He took solace in the knowledge that, at least symbolically, the seat of his ancestors was no longer in enemy hands. Yet he also heard the rumor that the boys, Bran and Rickon, were indeed dead, leaving him the sole remaining Stark heir aside from his half-brother, Jon Snow, who served with the Night's Watch. The news burdened Robb with grief as he pressed on, determined to avenge the crimes against his family. And though his mother, Catelyn, clung to a faint hope that the rumor might prove false, the gloom that hovered around Robb weighed heavily on the war effort. As the northern host maneuvered against Tywin Lannister, both sides realized that outside forces might soon shift the balance. Stannis Baratheon launched his assault on King's Landing, only to be repelled by the sudden arrival of Tywin Lannister's forces that had marched from Harrenhal at the perfect moment. They say that victory at the Blackwater belongs to Tywin, but also to the cunning of Tyrion Lannister and the timely intervention of House Tyrell. With King's Landing safe, the Lannisters turned renewed attention to the northern threat. Unbeknownst to Robb, Tywin had hammered out an arrangement with Walder Frey to entrap the young wolf in a pit of false hospitality. The Freys, eager to gain favor with the Lannisters and avenge Robb's broken vow, prepared a wedding invitation for the king in the north, hoping to lure him back to the twins. However, in this timeline, there was a fundamental difference. House Bolton was not party to that conspiracy. The Red Wedding, as it came to be known in the original canon, hinged upon the collaboration of the Freys and the Boltons, with Tywin orchestrating the arrangement behind the scenes. Here, while Tywin and Walder Frey maintained their secret pact, the Boltons remained loyal to the Crown of the North. That shift threatened to unravel or at least weaken the planned treachery. Roose Bolton's absence from the plot meant that the conspirators had one fewer dagger hidden in the dark. But Walder Frey was not easily discouraged. He believed that, with or without Bolton, he might trap Robb if he could coax him to the twins for Edmure Tully's wedding to Rosalind Frey, a union intended to repair the broken alliance. When news of the proposed wedding reached Robb, it came with lavish assurances of House Frey's good faith. Catelyn Stark, ever cautious, pressed her son to consider the Boltons' earlier warnings, and so Robb decided to consult Roose directly. If there was anyone who might glean a hint of hidden plots from Walder Frey, it was the subtle lord of the Dreadfort. The two men conferred in Riverrun. By that time, Edmure Tully had met Rosalind Frey and found her pleasant enough, eager to forge a truce. Edmure insisted it would be best for the Riverlands to mend fences with Walder Frey. They needed the crossing, and the Freys could be formidable allies if placated. And so, a wedding was set to take place at the Twins, with the king in the north expected to attend as a gesture of goodwill. Still, Robb was uneasy. He remembered Roose's earlier intelligence regarding Walder Frey's secret letters. "My Lord Bolton," Robb said, pacing near the hearth in Riverrun Solar, "what do you make of these new promises? My uncle Edmure says the Freys pledge no hostility. They claim they simply wish to see their daughter wed and alliances mended." Roose tilted his head slightly. The old Frey's pride was wounded, but men can be mollified by alliances, and there is a chance the wedding is genuine. But my instincts caution me. Lord Walder wrote letters to Tywin Lannister when last I had them intercepted. We have no evidence that he ceased such correspondence. A hush filled the room. Robb and Catelyn exchanged glances. Would he be so bold as to plan a trap at a wedding? Catelyn asked softly. He would break the sacred laws of guest right? I cannot believe even Walder Frey would stain his own name so. Desperate men have done worse, answered Roose. He paused, measuring his words. I would not advise you to attend with the full strength of your host unawares. If you wish to show good faith, do so, but place watchers. Post outriders. Let me dispatch my best men to circle the twins from a distance. If the Freys intend treachery, we will have warning. It was prudent counsel. Robb nodded, resolved to take extra precautions. Thus, when the king in the north arrived at the twins for Edmure's wedding, he did not come alone, and he did not come with his entire host vulnerable. He brought a carefully selected retinue, as well as an outer ring of scouts who maintained contact with Roose Bolton's men, lying in wait a league or two away from the Frylands. The wedding festivities began almost as in the other telling of events. Music, feasting, forced jollity, Walder Frey's sneering courtesy. Robb was accompanied by his queen, Talisa, though in the original story, that spelled a dreadful fate for her. Here, amid the noise and pomp, no immediate sign of treachery emerged. But as the feast progressed, one of Bolton's scouts, disguised among the crowd, slipped away to pass a hurried message beyond the camp. The Freys had men stationed in hidden alcoves, crossbows at the ready, and a suspicious retinue of Lannister bannermen had been spotted nearby. With that intel, the Watchers swiftly lit a signal fire that soared into the dark. Out on the outskirts, Roose Bolton's cavalry stirred. Within the great hall, Robb was already beginning to sense the tension. The music changed to the Rains of Castamere, the dread Lannister tune. Walder Frey, with his watery eyes, looked far too amused for a mere wedding host. Catelyn Stark glanced nervously at her son. Something was wrong, but the king in the north refused to panic. He had come prepared. Men had been stationed strategically, though not enough to prevent a massacre if crossbows started firing from every gallery. In the original telling, it was too late the moment the doors were sealed. But in this version, the door that might have sealed shut was forcibly opened from the outside. Bolton men, acting on the prearranged signal, forced their way into the twins, swords drawn. On the roof, hidden crossbowmen found themselves ambushed by northern rangers who scaled the walls in near silence. There was chaos. Walder Frey rose, screeching for his men to attack, shrieking curses at the insolent infiltration. Crossbow bolts still flew, and some loyal Northmen fell at the tables, a horror reminiscent of the original Red Wedding. But the tide quickly turned. Robb Stark drew his sword, leading the fight within the hall. Roose Bolton's men, who had been scanning the perimeter from the outset, poured in with deadly efficiency. Their infiltration on the roof neutralized many crossbowmen before they could rain death upon the wedding party. Those who tried to seal the doors found them forced open by men from House Bolton and House Stark. Outside, more northern soldiers closed on the twins, halting a small band of Freys who attempted to ride for reinforcements. The fight was messy, the shock of betrayal still cutting deep. Servants and minstrels screamed, diving under tables. The music dissolved into a cacophony of steel and shouting. Edmure Tully, still clad in wedding finery, seized a fallen sword and tried to defend his bride, Rosalind, who cowered behind him. While some of her Frey kin had joined in the treachery, Rosalind herself was trembling, tears shining in her eyes, entirely unprepared for the carnage. The fighting was vicious. Walder Frey's men had the initial advantage of position, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the northern infiltration that had been planned by Roose and Robb. In the chaos, Walder Frey himself tried to flee. He was seized by a pair of Bolton soldiers, who pinned his arms and dragged him before Robb Stark. The old man sputtered vile insults, complaining of broken vows and humiliations. He screeched that guest right was worthless if the guest came prepared for battle. Robb, heart-pounding, stared at the treacherous old lord. He might have been tempted to slay Walder Frey on the spot, but Catelyn's voice cut through, cautioning him. Killing Walder Frey in the midst of a chaotic fight was one thing, but to do it in cold blood might brand them oathbreakers themselves. And so Robb Stark weighed the price of mercy versus justice. Ultimately, he decided that Walder Frey, having attempted to slaughter them all, deserved no pity. He decreed that Walder Frey was a traitor who had broken both guest right and sworn fealty. With a glance at Roose Bolton, who stood near with a silent expression, Robb gave the order. Walder Frey was to be taken prisoner and delivered to Riverrun, there to face trial before the assembled lords of the North and Riverlands. Some pockets of Frey resistance lingered, but the presence of the northern forces, combined with the swift infiltration, ended the conflict. Many Frey knights and lesser scions died in the attempt, but a few, including the frightened Rosalind, surrendered. In the aftermath, as bodies were cleared from the hall, the Northmen discovered the scale of the planned massacre. Dozens of crossbow bolts were hidden in corners. A band of men with swords had been stationed behind concealed passages. If not for the intelligence from Bolton scouts and their infiltration plan, the wedding feast would have ended in a wholesale slaughter of Robb Stark's retinue, possibly robbing the North of its king, and handing Tywin Lannister a near-bloodless victory. In that single night, history diverged sharply from the story once told. King Robb Stark survived the horrors that would have been the Red Wedding. Catelyn Stark survived, though deeply shaken. Edmure Tully remained alive as well, alongside his newly wedded wife, though the marriage was now overshadowed by treachery and bloodshed. House Frey was broken, or at least severely diminished, its once vast brood now scattered or imprisoned. And the North, so nearly undone by betrayal in the original timeline, instead stood strong, aided in no small part by the unwavering, if cold, loyalty of House Bolton. In the days that followed, Walder Frey was carted away to face a tribunal of Northern and Riverlord justices. Some called for execution, Others urged imprisonment or demanded large ransoms from the Frey heirs who remained free. Ultimately, with Tywin Lannister unable to swiftly intervene, the old man found himself facing condemnation for attempted mass murder under guest right, a crime so vile that few lords in Westeros would openly defend him. The final sentence was death, but not by the flaying knives of House Bolton. Robb Stark, still struggling to reconcile vengeance with honor, deemed that the traitor should be beheaded in the old northern way, by the one who passed the sentence. And so, on a grim morning in the courtyard of Riverrun, Robb Stark took the sword ice, reclaimed after Ned Stark's passing at the hands of the Lannisters in King's Landing was still a distant dream. But here let us suppose the Starks have found a worthy greatsword to stand in for the lost ancestral blade, and struck off the head of Walder Frey. The realm whispered of the justice done. The absence of a successful Red Wedding changed the war's complexion significantly. The shock that would have shattered northern unity was averted. House Bolton, by remaining loyal and vigilant, saved Robb Stark's kingship. Perhaps ironically, it also enhanced Roose Bolton's influence. Bannermen who once eyed him with suspicion now recognized the critical role he had played in preventing catastrophe. Robb Stark, grateful but wary, kept Roose Bolton close, granting him renewed respect. Some whispers claimed that House Bolton's status might rise even further, that they would soon rival House Stark itself in the north. But Roose, for his part, demurred, continuing to serve as a quiet, indispensable strategist. As the North avoided the Red Wedding tragedy, Tywin Lannister recognized that the war would not end swiftly. Stannis Baratheon might have been turned away from King's Landing, but his threat simmered on Dragonstone. The Tyrells had allied themselves with the Lannisters, and King Joffrey still sat the Iron Throne, despised by many in the realm. Yet Tywin's best hope to break the North had just collapsed with Walder Frey's downfall. Another attempt at dividing the Stark bannermen was unlikely to succeed, as news of the Frey's treachery made the Northmen even more vigilant. South of the Neck, the war pressed on. With winter creeping closer, Robb Stark knew he could not remain indefinitely in the south, harrying the Lannisters. The supply lines stretched thin, and the men grew tired of extended campaigns. But the king in the north also knew that any compromise with the Lannisters would betray his father's memory and yield no justice for Ned's death. At last, he listened to advice from Roose Bolton and others. Push for a negotiated truce. Let the Lannisters keep their Iron Throne for now if they recognized the independence of the North. That was, in truth, Tywin Lannister's worst nightmare, watching the Seven Kingdoms fracture. Yet the old lion also recognized that crushing the North by force had proven elusive. The moment for cunning slaughter had passed, and the North now had entrenched positions in the Riverlands, as well as their own territory fully reclaimed, save for some coastal holdings still harried by the Ironborn. While Tywin would have preferred to see House Stark destroyed, he had to weigh the cost of continuing the war against the pressing need to keep the realm stable. Besides, with the Tyrells at his side, Tywin could afford to wait. Perhaps the North would weaken itself eventually. Perhaps winter would do the job. Begrudgingly, negotiations commenced, facilitated by the devout and neutral House Tyrell, who had reason to seek peace and let the land heal under a new alliance. The parley took place near the Eye of the Gods, a lake not far from Harrenhal, in the presence of minor lords from neutral Riverland houses. Robb Stark arrived with a modest escort, including Roose Bolton, Great John Umber, and other staunch supporters. Tywin Lannister brought Kevan Lannister, the newly minted Lord of the Twins, from among the surviving Freys who had sworn loyalty to the crown, and a cadre of gold-cloaked knights. They squared off across a large tent, tensions running high. The terms were bitter for both sides. Robb insisted on independence for the North, free of fealty to the Iron Throne, as well as official recognition of the Riverlands' autonomy under House Tully. Tywin found that last point appalling, unwilling to yield control of the Riverlands, a region historically tied to the Iron Throne. Yet he also recognized that pressing the fight might cost more blood and gold than he wished to spill, especially with restive lords in the Westerlands complaining about ruined trade. The memory of how the Boltons had outmaneuvered the Freys weighed heavily. Tywin was cunning enough to see that if the war dragged on further, the young wolf might broker alliances with more southern houses that hated the Lannisters, or else Stannis might strike again at a vulnerable moment. So a compromise was reached, albeit grudgingly. The North would remain a separate kingdom in name, but the Riverlands would remain nominally under the Iron Throne, though House Tully would keep wide-ranging autonomy. Formal hostilities would cease, Jaime Lannister would be ransomed back to the crown, and in return, Sansa Stark would be released from King's Landing once her forced marriage to Tyrion Lannister was annulled. Arya Stark's whereabouts remained unknown, but Tywin claimed no knowledge of her, so she was not included in the terms, though she might have been at large in the Riverlands, forging her own path of survival. The hostages exchanged, the gold paid, and war-weary men on both sides exhaled relief. Catelyn Stark, for her part, found the terms cold comfort. The family was not whole. 2 sons believed dead in Winterfell, 2 daughters scattered. Yet she recognized that continuing the war might not bring her children back. She insisted, quietly, on a vow from Robb that once peace was settled, they would do all they could to find Arya. Robb promised, voice thick with sorrow, wishing only that they had discovered a living Bran and Rickon. He would carry that guilt, believing he had failed to protect them. In the aftermath, the men of the North withdrew, returning to their homeland. Before crossing into their own lands, Robb Stark called a gathering of his lords. He announced that though the war was over, the North Mews remain vigilant. The Lannisters would forever be a threat, as would any southern king who craved dominion over them. This was their new age of independence, but with that independence came the burden of defending themselves. The lords nodded, accepting the weight of responsibility. Meanwhile, Roose Bolton stood among them, listening with a faint smile. He had emerged from the War of the Five Kings with an enhanced reputation, the quiet man who had never raised a blade against House Stark, but instead had saved them from the treachery of Walder Frey. Some might have whispered that House Bolton had more cunning than all the other northern houses put together, that perhaps one day the flayed man would overshadow the direwolf. But in this retelling, for now, House Bolton remained loyal. The seeds of suspicion might linger among those who recalled the old stories, but the memory of how Bolton's loyalty spared them a cataclysmic betrayal at the twins overshadowed that fear. Many recounted, in hushed voices over winter fires, how it was Roose Bolton's caution that saved the king in the north from a butchery that would have ended their hope of independence. Returning to Winterfell, the northern host discovered both devastation and uneasy restoration. The old keep still bore scars from the Ironborn's occupation. Smoke-stained stone and partially collapsed walls showed the cost of war. Ramsay Snow, in the weeks since retaking it, had established a harsh order. The battered people of Winterfell recognized the red flayed man banners alongside those of the direwolf. Some accepted it grudgingly. Others trembled at the rumored brutality of the bastard of Bolton. Yet they were heartened to see the king in the north at last return. Robb, dismounting in the courtyard, took in the sight of the battered keep. Ghosts of memory flickered in his mind. This was where he'd grown up, never imagining such ruin would befall his home. Ramsay emerged to greet him, wearing the sigil of House Bolton. He made a show of bowing, an overly theatrical gesture that did not quite suit the moment. Robb thanked him curtly for reclaiming Winterfell, demanded to see the place where Theon Greyjoy was imprisoned. Theon, broken by torture, hardly recognized Robb. His hair was matted, and he babbled half apologies, half curses, fear in his eyes. Robb gazed at him in silent sorrow and anger. Here was the boy who had been his friend, who had betrayed the North, and who, by all reports, had murdered 2 children believed to be the Stark boys. Robb wanted to rage at Theon, to kill him, but found only empty hollow grief. He ordered that Theon remain a prisoner until a proper trial could be convened. If the old ways were to be honored, the king in the north himself might mete out justice. However, Catelyn, who arrived some days later, suggested they might hold Theon as a bargaining chip against the Iron Islands if Balon Greyjoy ever tried to press further attacks. During that time, rumors reached Robb and Catelyn that Bran and Rickon might yet live, having fled Winterfell during Theon's short reign. Those rumors were impossible to confirm, but they ignited faint hope in the hearts of the Starks. In the original tale, that discovery was overshadowed by the rise of House Bolton's betrayal, with Ramsay's reaving overshadowing the northern countryside. But here, with the Boltons still loyal, the search for the missing Stark boys commenced in earnest. Robb sent out loyal rangers, searching the forests, the barrows, every holdfast that might provide a clue. The search would take time, but for the first time since Theon's betrayal, the king in the north truly believed he might find his brothers alive. As the realm settled into an uneasy lull, the new king in the north considered the pressing matters of governance. He needed to restore Winterfell, to ensure a stable flow of food with winter creeping closer, and to maintain vigilance against the Ironborn. He also had to appease his Riverlands allies, who, under Edmure Tully, remained a separate but allied region. The Lannisters might leave them be for now, but no one believed peace would last forever. Word from the south spoke of Joffrey's continuing reign, guided by Tywin Lannister, who orchestrated alliances and marriages to secure his family's power. Sansa Stark, under the terms of the truce, was returned, albeit with bitterness at the Lannisters. She was welcomed back to her brother's side in Winterfell, though the ruined keep offered little comfort. There, she learned of the sorrowful state of the North, of her believed dead younger brothers, and of the still missing Arya. Her spirit, shaped by captivity in King's Landing, now had a glimmer of relief at being home, but also a heavy burden of grief. Amid these changes, the role of House Bolton took on a curious new shape. The North recognized the sacrifices the Dreadfort men had made in the war. No one could deny that they had prevented a massive betrayal. Yet the presence of Ramsay, the bastard of Bolton, in Winterfell cast a long shadow. Stories of cruelty spread among the small folk, though few could confirm them. Robb, now the rightful king, found himself with no easy solution. Roose Bolton quietly transferred his son away from Winterfell, under the premise of better ensuring stability in the Dreadfort. Perhaps Roose saw that placing Ramsay too close to the seat of House Stark would only breed trouble. Or perhaps even the cunning father recognized that his son's worst impulses needed to be contained, lest they poison the loyalty that House Bolton had so carefully maintained. And so Ramsay was sent back east with a retinue of Bolton men, official keepers of the lands near the White Knife and the Last River. There, he would do less damage under the watchful eyes of loyal captains who reported directly to Roose. Winterfell, still half ruined, began a slow process of restoration under the direction of men sent by House Manderly, architects, builders, carpenters. The memory of Ned Stark was invoked often, inspiring the North to band together and rebuild rather than dwell on the tragedies that had nearly destroyed them. One day, King Robb Stark and Lord Roose Bolton stood atop the walls of Winterfell, gazing out across the snow-laden forests. The wind was sharp, biting at their cloaks. Winter had settled upon the land in earnest, painting the horizon white. But the seat of House Stark was no longer threatened from within. The two men spoke in low tones, discussing the matter of a new fortress watch, the potential threat of White Walkers, an old wives' tale, or so many believed, and the growing news from the wall that something dark stirred beyond the icy barrier. Roose, with his ever-measured demeanor, did not scoff at these rumors as much as other lords might. He had a streak of realism that recognized threats must be assessed. "We fought a war against the South," Robb said quietly, "but perhaps the greatest threat might come from the far north in the end. There are tales of wildlings amassing, of wights that roam in the snow." Roose's pale eyes flickered. "If we do not remain united, we stand little chance against such phantoms. The North cannot afford another war among its own. We must stand by you, your grace." Robb nodded. He had come to rely on Roose Bolton in ways he never expected. While he might never fully trust the man's heart, indeed, Roose's presence was too cold, too calculating for true friendship. Robb had come to understand that the Lord of the Dreadfort was indispensable in matters of strategy and politics. Now that the war with the Lannisters had paused, Robb intended to shift his focus to securing his kingdom's internal stability. That meant forging alliances among the northern houses, ensuring the loyalty of lesser bannermen, and preventing old grudges from turning into new conflicts. Word of a possible threat beyond the wall also reached the ears of the new king in the north. Samwell Tarly, a brother of the Night's Watch, had sent ravens south, warning of an otherworldly menace. In the original history, those warnings were often dismissed or overshadowed by the War of the Five Kings. Here, the North was no less wary of improbable tales, but Robb Stark, tempered by loss and newly minted authority, decided not to dismiss them entirely. He considered sending a contingent of men to Castle Black, led by trusted commanders. Perhaps the synergy of House Stark's name, through Jon Snow, though he was but a bastard, might help unify the Watch's efforts. That was a matter for the future, once the North had reorganized itself. Over the following weeks and months, slow but meaningful changes took root. The Northern Lords reconvened at Winterfell, participating in the Great Council of the North that Robb instituted, to discuss rebuilding. Lady Meage Mormont from Bear Island, Lord Wyman Manderley from White Harbor, Lord John Umber from Last Hearth, and many others. Roose Bolton was, of course, among them, quietly guiding the Dreadfort's interests and reaffirming loyalty to the crown. They debated everything from new trade routes to harvest distribution, mindful that the southern truce might be fragile. Robb sat in the seat once occupied by his father, listening with patience and a measure of sadness. Eddard Stark would have managed these councils with more stoicism and fairness than any man living. Robb sometimes felt the weight of that legacy upon him, worried that he would falter. But at least he had men around him who would not break faith. The ghost of betrayal that once hovered at the edges of the North had been, for now, dispelled. As the seasons turned, a trickle of new tidings arrived from the southern roads. King Joffrey had perished at his own wedding feast, presumably poisoned. Cersei Lannister accused Tyrion of the crime. Littlefinger schemed, the Tyrells maneuvered, and the Iron Throne's politics threatened to boil over once again. Yet the North, behind the fortified line of Moat Cailin and with the new acceptance of its independence, watched from afar, content to let the South entangle itself. The only true threat that concerned the North was the swirling rumor of White Walkers. For that, the king in the North began quietly training additional rangers, forging new alliances with the wildlings if they might be turned by parley instead of swords. Jon Snow at the Wall would become essential in bridging that divide. But that is another story, one that might unfold differently in this timeline. In time, the missing boys, Bran and Rickon, might reemerge, guided by loyal friends. The revelation that House Bolton had not turned on the Starks in their absence allowed them to return without fear of being handed over to foes. Perhaps their journey beyond the walls, across the haunted forests, and into contact with the ancient magic of the three-eyed raven played out similarly to the original tale, Bran's warging abilities growing under the tutelage of the Reeds, Rickon forging his own path in the wild. Eventually, they would discover that their family remained intact in many ways. Robb was king, their mother was alive, Sansa had returned, and the Boltons had not usurped their seat. This knowledge alone might have changed the shape of their quest, letting them decide how best to serve the North rather than fight to reclaim it from monstrous usurpers. Ramsay Snow, in this version of events, would remain a dangerous presence, overshadowed by a father who demanded loyalty to the crown. Without the impetus to betray House Stark, he might still indulge in personal cruelties, raiding small villages, terrifying local smallfolk, testing the boundaries of his father's patience. Whether Roose Bolton would eventually legitimize Ramsay as a Bolton might remain uncertain. That decision, in part, would hinge on whether the line of House Bolton had any other heirs or alliances. But as long as Roose retained a measure of control, the bastard's worst atrocities would be curbed, if not extinguished. Time passed, and the North, though scarred by war and haunted by rumors of an ancient icy threat, found itself relatively stable. The men who had once marched south under the Direwolf banner returned to their keeps and holdfasts, some with missing limbs or haunted eyes, but with stories of the Riverlands, of cunning Lannisters, and of a wedding that nearly became a massacre. They told of how House Bolton, rather than betraying the young wolf, foiled Walder Frey's monstrous plan and saved the king in the North from certain doom. Such tales wove themselves into new ballads sung around northern hearths. Some joked that it was the only time the sight of the flayed man brought hope instead of dread. Others muttered that one should never sleep too soundly when the Dreadfort's men were near, for the old ways of the Bolton clan might still lurk in the shadows. But fear and gratitude existed side by side. Robb Stark, chastened by war and personal grief, grew into his crown with each passing season. The illusions of youthful invincibility had fallen away, replaced by a tempered sense of duty. Without the Red Wedding to claim his life, he could continue forging the North's future. He had learned from the mistakes made in dealing with House Fry and sought to unify his bannermen with a firm but fair hand. Caitlin, by his side, served as an advisor and moral compass, though she too nursed the wounds of loss. The vow to find Arya hung between them, an unfulfilled promise that might one day be realized. For now, they could only hope she was safe somewhere on the roads of the realm. As winter's grip tightened, the White Harbor ships continued to bring fish and grain up the White Knife. The Manderleys, always practical, realized that if the North were to stand alone, they must build stronger trade relationships with Essos or the Free Cities. Ships from Bravos and Pentos began to sail into White Harbor, forging new commercial routes that the Iron Throne could not easily tax or disrupt. The North, in effect, started to become more self-sufficient. Lord Wyman Manderley, known for his cunning beneath a jovial exterior, also supported the king in the North's readiness to aid the Night's Watch if the rumored threats materialized. He recognized, as did many pragmatic northern lords, that if a new long night fell, all the petty politics of the South would become meaningless. The forging of a more prepared North became the quiet project that occupied Robb Stark and his closest advisors. Though they had no certain proof that the White Walkers were real, nor guaranteed that the southern kingdoms would not strike at them again, they braced for both possibilities. Moat Cailin was refortified, the fortresses along the White Knife were manned, and watchtowers were erected at key points. Scouts roamed the mountains and the Wolfswood, ensuring no new threat would take them by surprise. House Bolton contributed to these endeavors, sending engineers, archers, and supplies for fortifications. The Dreadfort's men, under Lord Bolton's watchful command, had proven themselves as disciplined soldiers. Their silent, intimidating presence made them effective as watchers on the frontier. No longer were they overshadowed by secret ambitions to supplant House Stark. Instead, they gained a measure of grudging respect for their reliability. Of course, in the far corners of the North, old superstitions thrived, whispered rumors that one day the Boltons might yet show their true colors. But in this timeline, at least, that day had not come. As the realm drifted toward the future, the final shape of the story hinged on many threads. The fate of Arya Stark, whether Bran and Rickon would eventually return to reclaim their place in the family, and how the White Walkers, if they indeed rose in force, would be met at the Wall. The presence of a living king in the North, supported by House Bolton and the other loyal houses, would drastically alter how the realm responded to the looming threat. It might be that the North, unified under Robb's leadership, could rally behind Jon Snow at Castle Black, forging alliances with the wildlings to turn back the darkness beyond the Wall before it spilled over. It might be that the grudges of the South would resurface, drawing the North into another costly war. But for now, the heartbreak of the Red Wedding had never come to pass, and the North remained in the hands of House Stark, unbroken. In a rare moment of peace within the Great Hall of Winterfell, Robb sat upon the wooden seat that replaced the charred ancient high seat for the time being, flanked by the tattered banners of the Direwolf. Beside him, Catelyn Stark and Sansa Stark listened as a steward read the day's business. A line of petitioners formed near the dais, among them small folk seeking redress for damaged farmland, local merchants requesting improved roads, and representatives from lesser houses who had their own grievances. Outside, fresh snow blanketed the courtyard, reminding all within of the ongoing winter. Above the dais, the faint flicker of torchlight danced on the stone walls, revealing the half-finished repairs that strove to erase the scars of Theon's occupation. Occasionally, Robb's eyes flicked toward an empty space near his mother, where Bran and Rickon should have sat if the world had been fair. That sorrow lingered, fueling his determination to lead the North with the honor his father had instilled in him. The hall was warmer than the world outside, but still held an edge of cold. It seemed the perfect metaphor for life in the North, a cold land warmed by the fierce loyalty of its people. The day's business concluded with the approach of one more visitor, a courier from the Dreadfort. He bore news from Lord Bolton, detailing the watch patterns along the eastern roads, the possibility of a small skirmish with rogue ironborn reavers near the stony shore, and a newly uncovered rumor of whites beyond the wall. Robb listened intently. The courier's calm, precise words carried the stamp of Roose Bolton's own personality. No flamboyant phrases, no emotional entreaties, just facts, potential threats, and recommendations for dealing with them. Once the courier finished, Robb nodded, dismissing him with thanks. Then, quietly, the king in the north turned to his mother and sister, the weight of rulership pressing upon him. For a moment, he reflected on how this might all have been lost if House Bolton had chosen betrayal, how the entire north might have drowned in blood at the twins. A silent gratitude toward his once suspected bannerman welled inside him, mingled with a wariness that never fully faded. Trust in House Bolton would always be tempered by caution. But for now, at least, it was trust that had been earned by deeds. That evening, Robb walked the battlements of Winterfell, accompanied by Grey Wind, his direwolf, who padded silently at his side. The sky was clear, the stars bright, their light reflecting off the snow-covered rooftops and walls. He thought of the future, of restoring Winterfell, finding Arya, confirming once and for all if Bran and Rickon lived. He thought of the possibility that the White Walkers were real, that the realm might need a united front to face them. And he thought of his unborn child, as Talisa was carrying new life. If a new generation of Starks was soon to come into the world, the duty to safeguard the North felt even heavier on his shoulders. He paused at a parapet, resting his hands on the cold stone, gazing out across the wintry expanse. In the quiet of that moment, Grey Wind let out a low rumbling growl, his amber eyes fixed on something unseen. But there was no immediate danger, no sign of an intruder. Perhaps it was only the ghosts of memory that haunted the direwolf. Robb placed a hand on his companion's thick fur, murmuring awfully for calm. Somewhere in the distance, he imagined the shape of what might have been if House Bolton had turned cloak as many expected. Would he have been murdered at the twins, the music of the Rains of Castamere echoing in his dying ears? Would his kingdom have shattered, his people left without a Stark to lead them, prey to the Lannisters? The thought chilled him far more than the winter wind. But that was not the fate of this North. In this turning of the wheel, House Bolton had remained steadfast, and though no man could predict what new storms lay on the horizon, the North stood ready. Robb felt certain, at least, that the memory of what they had survived, the heartbreak of Ned's execution, the betrayal by Theon, the near massacre at the twins, would fortify them. Let the South scheme and bleed itself. Let the cold winds rise from beyond the wall. The North was not broken, and so long as winter reigned, they would remember that unity, not treachery, was the mightiest shield against the cruelties of the world. And so the story reached a new equilibrium, one shaped by loyalty where betrayal once held sway. Through the loyalty of House Bolton, the king in the North endured. The twin tragedies of the Red Wedding and the sacking of Winterfell never reached their terrible zenith. In their place, a different future opened for the North. Battered but not beaten, led by a Stark who bore the lessons of war in his heart, allied to a cunning bannerman whose unwavering oath became a cornerstone rather than a knife in the dark. Whether that unity would hold against the gathering shadows in the far north or the intrigues that still brewed in the south remained an open question. Yet for now, one thing was certain. The North was guarded from within, and the specter of a Bolton betrayal had become but another whisper lost in the howling wind of winter nights. The snows fell hard in that first winter after the false peace, layering Winterfell's half-reconstructed walls in thick drifts of white. By twilight, the entire courtyard seemed transformed by the hush of falling snow. It glistened in the torchlight, nearly hiding the black scars that still marred the old stone. Where walls had once been proud and unblemished, now they showed hairline cracks and soot stains from the months of occupation under Theon Greyjoy, but the rebuilding efforts were making slow progress. Scaffolding stood along the southern rampart, and piles of timber and quarried stone were arrayed in the ward, waiting for daylight and the steady hands of laborers. Within the keep, King Robb Stark moved from room to room, checking on the final repairs for the night. Each chamber told a story. In some, he saw fresh wood-reinforcing half-crumbled walls. In others, he noted broken windows hastily boarded up against the frigid wind. He paused in one of the corridors near the maester's turret, remembering how, as a boy, he had run along these very halls in boisterous games of tag with John and Theon. John was off at the wall, presumably leading or training with the Night's Watch. Theon was now a prisoner, locked beneath Winterfell, just as he had once been a ward in the castle, though under far kinder circumstances. It weighed on Robb's heart, this brutal irony, and he sometimes wondered if there had been a way to turn Theon from his betrayal before it was too late. He took a step toward a window embrasure where wind whistled through a crack in the masonry. Here, the draft was strong. It tugged his fur cloak and teased the flame of a nearby sconce. The world outside was a deep gray haze, with the swirl of snow dulling the faint moonlight. That same hush that always accompanied a heavy snowfall reminded Robb of how fragile everything remained. Yes, they had secured the North's nominal independence from the Iron Throne. But what good was independence if the realm was battered, hungry, and haunted by rumors of a threat beyond the wall? To the south, the Lannisters were still entrenched in King's Landing, forging new alliances and shoring up their power with the Tyrells. And even with the war's pause, Robb knew that Tywin Lannister's ambitions were not easily thwarted. Turning away from the window, Robb continued his inspection. Before he descended the steps, he caught sight of a figure approaching. His mother, Catelyn Stark, wrapped in a heavy cloak of gray wool. Their eyes met in the corridor's dancing firelight. Catelyn's face bore new lines that had not been there when Robb first rode south at the beginning of the war. That was an inevitability. She had lost her husband, believed 2 of her younger sons dead, though faint rumors suggested otherwise, and endured a near massacre that had only been averted by timely intervention. Yet there was a resoluteness in her step that Robb recognized from childhood. She was a Tully by blood and a Stark by marriage, and she had not yielded to despair. "Robb," she said softly, stopping a few paces away. "Another late night?" He nodded. The stonemasons reported cracks in the ramparts. "I wanted to make sure the castle's secure before the worst of winter sets in." There was a storm on the horizon that threatened to make travel nearly impossible for weeks at a time. Catelyn's gaze drifted to the half-reinforced ceiling overhead. "Do you remember, we used to dread the idea of winter because it meant fewer visitors, fewer feasts? But now, after everything," she sighed, a breath that clouded in the cold corridor, "I worry we aren't prepared for the long night." Robb stiffened slightly. "We'll get by." Harvests were better than expected in some regions, particularly around White Harbor. Lord Manderley has been shipping grain north, and we have what we seized from the Ironborn storehouses, as well as the supplies we brought back from the Riverlands. "That will help," his mother agreed. Then, a catch in her voice. "I only wish we knew for certain about Bran and Rickon. We've heard the rumors, that they escaped Theon, that the bodies the Ironborn burned were not their own, but no one has brought proof." "Not yet," Robb said, gently taking her hand. "But I've sent rangers west and north. The Umbers and Glovers will keep watch for any sign of them. If they're alive, I swear to you we will find them." The mention of the Glovers reminded Catelyn of Deepwood Motte, which had also been seized by the Ironborn for a time before the end of hostilities. It had been retaken with heavy fighting, but the new status of that region remained precarious, like everything else in the north. She looked at Robb, gaze brimming with a mother's concern. "And Arya?" There was a pause. Robb exhaled slowly. Still no word. The last we knew, she might have been fleeing around the Riverlands. The war, the chaos. If only I had searched more thoroughly, but I had to focus on the battlefield, on forging alliances, on... Catelyn placed a hand on his cheek, stopping him. "None of this is your fault, Robb. We do what we can." He offered a small nod, not entirely convinced. Then, pressing his lips together, he changed the subject. "Get some rest, Mother. The Dreadfort men arrived earlier with fresh news, and I'm meeting with Lord Bolton in the morning. Perhaps that will give us some sense of direction." She nodded gravely and turned to go. Robb watched her retreating figure until she vanished around a bend in the corridor. Then he returned his gaze to the moonlit world beyond the window, letting the hush of falling snow settle in his mind. Morning broke with dull gray light that did little to dispel the shadows in Winterfell's great hall. The braziers were stoked, and servants hurried about, placing steaming kettles of weak ale and trays of hot bread on the high table. The clang of carpenters' hammers drifted from beyond the walls, a ceaseless reminder that the castle itself was still under repair. Gathering around the table were several of the North's prominent lords. Great John Umber, shorter than one might imagine a man called Great John should be, but broad-shouldered and loud of voice. Lady Meage Mormont, clad in a heavy bearskin cloak. Lord Wyman Manderley, who had just arrived from White Harbor with news of ships returning from Bravos. And last, Lord Roose Bolton, quietly removing his gloves as he surveyed the room with his pale eyes. Robb entered, nodding greetings to each. He took his seat at the head of the long table, gray wind loping at his heels. The dire wolf settled beside him, ears alert. In the hush that followed, Catelyn Stark slipped in to sit near her son, offering each lord a courteous inclination of her head. Across the table, Roose Bolton inclined his own head toward the king in the north, his expression as unreadable as ever. "My lords," Robb began, "welcome back to Winterfell. I trust your travels were not too harsh." Great John Umber thumped the table with a huge palm. "Bleeding cold, that's what it was. Snow so deep in some passes I had to leave half my men behind. But we got here in time to do what's needed." Lady Mormont nodded. "Bear Island's used to storms, but even we found the drifts waist-deep in places." Lord Manderley, puffing from exertion, said, "White Harbor hasn't been hit as hard by snow, though the winds have been fierce. We had 3 ships come in from Essos, brought grain, salted fish, some cloth. We'll distribute them as you see fit, your grace." Robb thanked him, then glanced at Roose Bolton. "Lord Bolton, your men have been traveling the interior roads this past fortnight. What is the state of the realm?" Roose leaned forward, speaking in his low, measured tone. "The interior roads, especially those leading east from the Dreadfort, are passable but dangerous. We've encountered pockets of reavers, most likely Ironborn left behind when the Greyjoys retreated. My knights have dealt with them in short order, but I advise dispatching patrols to root out any who remain." Robb nodded. "We'll see to that. And how stands the Dreadfort? Any trouble with food stores or rebellious small folk?" "None worth noting," Roose replied. "We spent the autumn securing as much late harvest as we could. The Dreadfort is well provisioned for at least another 5 or 6 moons. As for rebellious small folk," he offered a faint shrug, as if dismissing the notion, "they remain cowed or simply content. We do not give them reason to rise." The faintest shiver ran through Catelyn, remembering stories of House Bolton's old reputations, but her expression remained composed. She could not deny that Roose Bolton's loyalty had spared them a worse fate in the war. She owed him a measure of trust, or at least gratitude. "Theon Greyjoy's men were not all accounted for," Lady Mormont said, frowning. "Some fled into the forests or vanished after losing holdfasts. If they're banding together, they might be planning more raids in the interior." "That cannot stand," Robb declared. "We'll coordinate with your men, Lord Bolton. Send out small patrols from the Mormont lands, from Last Hearth, from the Dreadfort. Ensure no reavers find safe ground." The Great John nodded eagerly. "I will flush them out. Let the crows feast on their eyes." Catelyn listened quietly. Though these matters might have seemed small mere pockets of bandits, she recognized that any disruption to the North's tenuous stability could become dangerous, especially in the throes of winter. Finally, Robb turned the discussion to a more daunting concern. "We have also heard rumors from the Wall, stories of White Walkers. I know how it sounds, but the Night's Watch has sent ravens south, pleading for aid." The table fell silent. Some of the lords exchanged skeptical looks. Lady Mormont murmured, "I've heard tales from the Bear Island fisherfolk that lights in the sky heralded strange sightings in the far north. The old songs speak of such things, but no one living has seen them. None that we can confirm, at least." Lord Manderley huffed. "My men dismiss it as fancy. We've all grown up with ghost stories. Yet if the Night's Watch claims an actual threat, we can't ignore it entirely. Roos's pale eyes flickered with something akin to interest. Indeed, if the White Walkers are real, it would be folly not to heed the warning. Still, we should confirm the facts. The Watch might be desperate for men, or they might be exaggerating to gain support. One cannot be sure. Rob nodded. I propose we send a small contingent to the Wall to speak with Lord Commander Mormont, if he still holds that post, and see what's truly happening. It must be volunteers, men who can handle the cold and possible danger. We can spare a few knights from each major house. Great John Umber snorted. We can go ourselves if needed, but men are needed in the castles too. A small, strong group, Rob reiterated. We'll equip them with the best we can provide. Lady Mormont said, if they're to meet with Lord Commander Mormont, it would be wise for one of my own to go. He is, after all, a Mormont. My cousin Jarrell might volunteer. Decide among yourselves who will go, Rob said. We'll finalize the party before any major storms bar the roads. The watchers on the wall can't wait forever. With that, they turned to other matters. The distribution of supplies, the attempts to fix the Rosby Road to facilitate a trickle of trade with the South, and quiet speculation about what might be happening in King's Landing. Caitlin kept her gaze steady on each speaker, though she felt a pang whenever the conversation touched the subject of the South. Since the war's partial end, Sansa had returned to them, but Joffrey's death at his wedding, a wedding that overshadowed the same day Sansa left the city, had plunged King's Landing into chaos. No one at the table had illusions that the Lannisters were weak, but they were certainly distracted by the Tyrell ambitions, by accusations over Joffrey's murder, and by the restiveness of the Crownlands. For the moment, the North had been granted a reprieve from southern entanglements. But how long would it last? Finally, the meeting ended. The lords departed for their separate tasks, checking on men, securing lodgings, or consulting with maesters. Only Roose Bolton lingered at the table as Rob rose, stretching his stiff back. Grey Wind paced near him, whiskers twitching at the presence of the quiet lord of the Dreadfort. I've spoken with some of your men, my lord, Rob said, trying to read Bolton's composed expression. They seem well-disciplined. They say the Dreadfort remains calm under your son's watch. Roose inclined his head with a near-imperceptible smile. Yes, Ramsay has been kept busy ensuring law and order. The threat of Ironborn Reavers gives him a suitable outlet. I have instructed him to avoid cruelty for cruelty's sake. Our focus must be on peace, not fear. Yet fear is sometimes an effective tool, Rob said gently, recollecting what he had learned from his father. That leadership was not always warm, but it should be fair. Still, I appreciate that your son is heeding your instructions. Of course, your grace. A slight narrowing of those pale eyes, perhaps the faintest sign of hidden thoughts. I have no desire to undo what the North has gained. Rob nodded, though a tension in his chest refused to dissolve. If House Bolton's loyalty had saved him from the horrors of a southern betrayal, it was still no guarantee that a man like Ramsay might not cause unforeseen problems. Perhaps that worry was best put aside. The immediate tasks of rulership required unity among the northern houses. He forced a smile. I'll see you at midday, Lord Bolton. The next shipment of stone from White Harbor arrives soon, and I'd like your advice on strengthening the castle's eastern wall. Roose bowed, then turned to leave, his black cloak sweeping over the stone floor. Rob watched him go, silently acknowledging a debt that he might never fully repay. The Dreadfort had stood by him and prevented the entire realm from losing the king in the north. Even if there was a wariness in Rob's heart, for now he would rely on Roose Bolton's counsel. That evening, as the cold deepened, Caitlin found her daughter Sansa wandering the gallery overlooking the Great Hall. Sansa leaned on the wooden railing, gazing down at the bustle below. The main hearth glowed with orange light, illuminating half a dozen servants who were laying out pallets of straw for the men who had arrived as part of the Lord's retinues. Sansa's breath came in faint puffs. She still wore a soft southern dress, albeit lined with fur to stave off the chill, and her auburn hair was coiled in a modest style. At the sound of her mother's footsteps, she glanced back, a small, tired smile flickering across her lips. "Mother," she said softly, turning to greet Caitlin. "I was just watching." Caitlin moved to stand beside her, resting her hands on the railing. "What do you see?" Sansa hesitated, as though searching for words. "I see men from all over the north, gathering to listen to Robb. I see them so weary yet also so loyal, and I think about how different it is from King's Landing. Their loyalty is just a hollow word. People only serve Joffrey or the Queen because they feared them or craved their favor. But here, these men truly believe in Robb." Caitlin observed her daughter's expression, reflective, matured by captivity and tragedy. She squeezed Sansa's hand gently. "And how are you adjusting to being home? Is there anything you lack?" Sansa shook her head, the corners of her mouth trembling. "It's just not truly home, is it? Not without father. Not without Arya, or Bran, or Rickon. Even the castle feels different. All these new walls being built, old sections still burnt. I remember Winterfell as warm and alive, but now it's wounded." Caitlin drew her into a gentle embrace. "We will heal it in time. We will heal ourselves, too." Sansa nodded against her mother's shoulder, hiding the tears that wanted to well up. In King's Landing, tears had been a weakness she could not afford. But here, she felt them threaten to break free every time she recalled the long nights under the Lannisters' thumbs. The memory of Joffrey's mocking grin made her shiver, though not from cold. "I wish I could help rebuild," she said. "I'm not a stonemason or a soldier, but I want to do something." "You already are," Caitlin reassured her. "You're here. You can help watch over the younger squires, teach them courtesy, help them adapt to the north. You can help me with the day-to-day tasks of running the household, keeping accounts, planning the meals, seeing to the small folks' needs. Those things matter more than you know." Sansa gave a small smile. "I suppose so." She looked down again. A group of Manderly men were laughing loudly by the hearth, shaking snow off their cloaks. She thought of Tyrion Lannister, her former husband by forced arrangement, though that marriage had been annulled as part of the truce. Oddly, he had treated her more gently than Joffrey ever did, but she could still not think of him without reliving the humiliations of the Red Keep. Yet it was behind her now. Home was here, no matter how battered. "I just wish we were all together again." Caitlin took a shaky breath. "So do I, but we must keep faith in the old gods that Bran and Rickon escaped, as we've heard. As for Arya, well, she always was resourceful, too stubborn to be lost. One day, we may wake to find her in the yard, practicing her needlework with swords." A faint laugh escaped her. "Wouldn't that be something?" At the image, Sansa's smile softened. It was a small, precious moment of warmth between mother and daughter, shared over the battered walls of a reeling castle. They stood there for a time, letting the hush of wind. Urfel's night enfolded them. Days passed, and the storms worsened. Fierce winds battered the north, dropping heavy snows that piled high against the castle walls. Travel became treacherous, and more than one messenger risked his life crossing the wintry expanses to deliver messages to Winterfell. Amid those swirling snows, the appointed band of rangers and knights prepared to depart for the wall. Meage Mormont had indeed sent her cousin, Jarell, and she was joined by a handful of others from House Umber and House Glover, men who prided themselves on their ability to survive in the wild. Robb, wanting to ensure good faith, asked Lord Roose Bolton to contribute one of his best men to the group, someone keen-eyed and loyal. Roose selected a lean knight named Ser Daemon Tallheart, who had sworn fealty to the Boltons after his small land was overrun by Ironborn. Though the name Tallheart was better known in association with Torrhen Square, Ser Daemon's father had been a minor offshoot, now pledged to the Dreadfort. On the morning of departure, Robb and a cluster of northern lords stood at Winterfell's gates to see them off. The wind howled through the courtyard, ruffling cloaks and half-snuffing torch flames. Jarell Mormont, wrapped in a thick bearskin, mounted her Garren, ready for the journey. She had a face weathered by sea winds and a direct manner that made her instantly likable. "Be safe," Robb said as he handed her a fresh packet of letters. "Give these to the Lord Commander, if he still lives, and any of the officers there who doubt our sincerity. Let them know the North is listening. Jarrell tucked the letters into a pouch. You'll hear back from me soon enough, Your Grace. If what they say is true, the dead themselves are on the march. But I'll reserve my judgment till I see it with my own eyes. Ser Damon, a quieter figure, nodded to Roose Bolton, who stood a few paces behind the king. Roose offered a thin, almost paternal smile, though paternal might have been the wrong word for the cool glint in his eyes. Ride carefully, he said. A man who vanishes in these storms might never be found. They exchanged final farewells, and the party of a dozen riders set out, forging north through the swirling drifts. Some minutes later, Rob and the lords watched their shapes vanish into the dim white horizon. Caitlin, who stood near the gatehouse, murmured, "They will have a rough journey. Are you certain we shouldn't have waited until the snows cleared?" Rob turned his face into the wind, eyes narrowed. "If the watch's reports are true, time may be the one thing we don't have." She nodded, understanding that waiting for better weather might mean ignoring a threat that could soon spread across the entire realm. And so the riders pressed on, leaving Winterfell behind them. Deep in the crypts of Winterfell, Theon Greyjoy languished in a stone cell, his arms thin and bruised from the manacles that bound him to the wall. The cell was damp, water dripping from the vaulted ceiling, forming icy patches in the corners. The only light came from a single torch set in the corridor. Every day or two, a guard brought him bread and water. Sometimes the guard was silent. Other times he sneered or muttered insults, calling Theon a traitor, a turncloak, a murderer of children. Theon's dark hair lay matted against his scalp, and the once proud grin he'd worn as a ward of Ned Stark was gone entirely. Now he shivered in the stale air, haunted by nightmares of betrayal. His own betrayal of the Starks, and of the bastard of Bolton who had taken him from the Ironborn's failed hold on Winterfell. Though Theon did not know the bastard's name, he remembered the leering face, the mocking tone. "Come with me if you want to live," the man had said, only to subject Theon to torment afterwards. Yet rumor had it that the father of that cruel bastard was now among the closest advisors to the king in the north. In his delirium, Theon sometimes raged. Other times he wept. He had no illusions left of being rescued by his family. They had abandoned him, or he them. He couldn't untangle the blame anymore. He had betrayed Robb Stark, who had once been closer than a brother. He had murdered 2 innocent boys, or at least that was what everyone believed. Theon knew the truth. The boys had not been Bran and Rickon, but 2 peasant orphans he dressed to seem like the Stark children. He had done it to scare the North, to prove himself to his father, but in the end, it gained him nothing but deeper guilt. Sometimes he thought of confessing the truth, but fear choked his words. Would it matter? The entire North believed Bran and Rickon dead, so Theon's confession might seem just another lie. One day, as he lay huddled in the corner, the echoing of boots on the stone steps alerted him to a visitor. Theon shielded his eyes from the sudden brightness of a torch carried by a tall, wiry man with thinning hair. Beside him, another guard held a ring of keys. "Greyjoy," said the first man, stepping closer. "Are you fit to stand?" Theon squinted, letting his eyes adjust. He recognized him as Maester Luwin's replacement, or some lesser steward who handled the prisoners. "What do you want?" he croaked, voice ragged. "You've an audience with the king," the steward said. "Up on your feet." Fear twisted Theon's insides. Robb Stark, the friend he had once betrayed. Theon found himself trembling as he struggled to stand. He had not used his legs much in recent days, and pins and needles prickled up his thighs. The guard unlocked the manacles, then helped haul Theon upright. The smell of his own unwashed body made Theon grimace. They gave him a threadbare cloak to cover his rags, then half-pushed him down the corridor. They guided him through the crypt's winding passages, past the ancient tombs of Stark kings who had once ruled the North in ages past. Theon felt their stone eyes glaring at him, as though the spirits of this place demanded retribution. Soon enough, they emerged into the pale daylight of the courtyard. Theon winced, drawing in a breath of cold air. Outside, the castle bustled with laborers and soldiers, but many paused to stare at the prisoner being led by the guard. Harsh whispers rippled through the crowd. Theon's cheeks burned, but he had no choice except to shuffle onward. They led him inside the main keep, up a short flight of steps into the great hall. This hall was still partially under repair. One wall bore fresh scaffolding, while new timbers for the roof supports lay stacked at the edges. A large fire roared in the central hearth, and beyond it, on a slightly raised dais, sat Robb Stark. Gray wind lay at Robb's feet, ears pricked, gaze fixed on Theon. A hush fell. It felt as though the entire castle had gathered along the edges of the hall. Guards, servants, and a few lords who had not yet departed. To Theon's right stood Roose Bolton, clad in somber black and wearing an expression that was neither friendly nor overtly hostile. On the left stood Great John Umber, arms folded across his broad chest, glowering at Theon. Finally, Theon's eyes flicked to Robb, who rose from his seat, slowly descending the dais steps until he stood only a few paces away. The hall was silent enough that Theon could hear the crackling of the hearth fire and the muffled whistle of the wind outside. Robb's face was set, stern, but Theon thought he saw a flicker of old heartbreak behind those blue-gray eyes. "Theon," he said quietly, "you stand before me as a prisoner, a traitor, and the presumed killer of my brothers." A ripple of tension swept through the onlookers. Theon swallowed hard. "Robb, your grace." He stumbled over the title, uncertain how to address the man he'd grown up with. Robb's gaze hardened. "I offered you friendship once. My father treated you like a son, even if you were our hostage. And you paid us back by seizing Winterfell, murdering innocents, and driving my people from their homes." A roar of agreement rose from some onlookers. Others merely stood in grim silence. Theon's hands shook, but he forced himself to speak. "I was a fool. My father, Bolton, he demanded a show of loyalty. I didn't know what else to do." "You knew that we were your friends," Robb snapped. "You could have chosen to stand with us. You could have returned to the Iron Islands and sought a different path. Instead, you spilled northern blood." Theon felt tears burn his eyes. Weakness. He should not cry now, not before the man he had betrayed. But the guilt and dread overwhelmed him. "I'm sorry," he rasped, though the words sounded hollow in his own ears. "I never wanted to kill your brothers. His voice faltered. Robb's posture wavered for the briefest instant. Then he said more quietly, "Those two boys, the ones you burned beyond recognition, were they truly Bran and Rickon?" Theon trembled. He could see the raw pain in Robb's face, the flicker of desperate hope. He wanted to speak the truth, to perhaps spare himself from the absolute hatred of the crowd. But would they even believe him? And if he confirmed the rumors that Bran and Rickon yet lived, what would that mean for him? Did it matter? His mouth felt as dry as sand. At length, he forced out the words, "No, they weren't." A stunned hush fell. Theon licked his cracked lips. I had them killed. They were two farm boys, children no one would miss. I wanted the North to believe your brothers were dead, to strengthen my hold. Bran and Rickon escaped. I don't know where they went. By the time I realized they'd fled, it was too late." Theon's voice caught on a sob, and he lowered his head. Some in the crowd hissed with disgust. The man had murdered innocent farm boys to fake the deaths of the Stark heirs. For a moment, Robb stood rigid, breathing hard. Then, incredibly, relief battled with rage in his face. If Theon was telling the truth, it meant Bran and Rickon might still live. That spark of hope burned in Robb's eyes. "You lied to us," Robb said slowly. "Made us all believe my brothers were gone. That is almost as monstrous as if you'd killed them yourself." Theon's shoulders shook. "I know," he whispered. "I know. He had no defense." A commotion rippled in the hall. Catelyn Stark stepped forward from the sidelines, eyes brimming with tears. She drew close to Robb, pressing a hand over her mouth, hardly daring to believe. "Robb," she whispered, "if this is true, if Bran and Rickon are out there." She turned her gaze onto Theon, a swirl of conflicting emotions plain on her face. Where did they go?" Theon shook his head. I don't know for certain. One of your wildling servants, Osha, disappeared with them along with the big stable boy, Hodder. They said something about the Godswood, the crypts. Maybe they fled north. That's all I know. Caitlin's hand gripped her son's arm. Rob inhaled sharply, leaning closer to murmur to her. We'll have to send out fresh search parties. This changes everything. Meanwhile, Great John Umber stomped forward, pointing a thick finger at Theon. He confesses to murdering peasant children as if that's any comfort. We should kill him right here, Your Grace. Let him taste justice for what he's done. A roar of assent came from a few corners of the hall. Men demanded blood. Theon paled, stumbling a step backward. If they came at him now, unarmed and broken as he was, he would die a gruesome death. Rob, though, raised his hand, calling for silence. He glanced at Caitlin, then at Roose Bolton, who stood by with an unreadable expression. Theon Greyjoy must face justice, but I want to know everything about his father's plans, whether Balon Greyjoy intends another invasion of the North. And more than that, if Theon can help us find my brothers, or confirm further details, then we need him alive for the moment. Umber's face twisted with frustration, but he bowed stiffly. As you say, but the moment he's no longer useful. You'll get your wish, Rob finished coldly. Then he motioned to the guards. Return him to his cell. Treat his wounds, feed him, just enough to keep him alive. I'll decide his fate once he's told us everything he knows. Before Theon could utter another word, the guards seized him by the arms, dragging him away from the dais. Grey Wind let out a soft growl as the prisoner was taken past. The crowd parted, some spitting on Theon, others jeering. Only a few watched with somber silence, as though pitying the pitiful creature that Theon had become. Rob stood there, chest heaving, fists clenched at his sides. Caitlin rested a hand on his shoulder. He turned to her, eyes brimming with a tumult of feeling. Hope that Bran and Rickon might be alive, fury at Theon's cruelty, guilt for not being in Winterfell to protect them. What do we do now, Mother? Rob asked in a low voice. We search, she said softly, tears welling anew. We search for my sons. That afternoon, fresh scouts were dispatched to comb every corner of the Wolfswood, the marshes near the Dreadfort and beyond. Word was sent to the Umbers, the Karstarks, the Manderleys, any who might find a clue about the whereabouts of the younger Stark boys. The North had braced itself for a long winter, but now it was galvanizing around a renewed purpose. Find the heirs of Winterfell if they still lived. The news spread among the small folk, inspiring rumors that drifted through holdfasts and villages. Some said they had glimpsed the crippled boy riding a giant's shoulders. Others claimed they'd seen a wolf that might have been Rickon's shaggy dog prowling near abandoned crofters' huts. The harsh weather made such stories difficult to confirm. Yet the possibility of the boys being out there, alive, lifted the spirits of many in the North. Roose Bolton, in private, sent a raven to his son, Ramsay, instructing him to keep a watchful eye for any clue. He did so in carefully couched language, reminding Ramsay that these Stark boys were not to be harmed, but rather aided if found. Ramsay, for his part, likely saw an opportunity to be the one who returned the missing heirs to the king, thereby earning more favor. Or, in the darkest corners of his mind, to use them as leverage if such an opportunity became convenient. But for the moment, his father's command was clear. Rob, for his part, wondered how Bran and Rickon would have survived so many months in the wilderness. Then he remembered that Bran was a warg, or so the old rumors said, capable of slipping into the body of his direwolf, Summer. Perhaps that gave him an edge in hiding. Rickon, though just a child, had a fierce spirit all his own. If they had Osha and Hodder to help them, perhaps they had stood a chance. In the gray quiet of evening, Rob retreated to his solar with Caitlin, Sansa, and a few trusted advisors, including Maester Luwin's successor, Maester Miles, an older man sent by the Citadel. There, by the glow of a table lantern, they pored over maps of the North, marking likely routes for the children's escape. The map was enormous, covering the table entirely. Dozens of tiny ink sigils marked holdfasts, rivers, valleys, and scattered villages. Bran knew these lands well enough, Robb said, touching the inky outline of a forest south of Winterfell. He often rode with me on hunts. But in winter, the farmland is barren, the rivers freeze in places. They can't have traveled too far without help. Catelyn peered closer, chewing her lip. Could they have sought refuge at the last hearth? The Umbers might have taken them in secretly. That's possible, Sansa said, though she spoke timidly, as though uncertain of her place in the discussion. Or maybe they headed for the wall to find Jon. Robb exhaled, exchanging a glance with Catelyn. Jon Snow, a brother though a bastard, currently a man of the Night's Watch. If Bran believed that was a safe haven, he might indeed have tried to reach the wall. But the path north was long and dangerous, especially for children. All we can do is wait for word, Catelyn said gently. We've sent out search parties to every stronghold. Someone must have seen them. Robb nodded, though impatience gnawed at his mind. He remembered how quickly the phrase had turned on them at the twins, how close the Starks had come to annihilation were it not for Roose Bolton's intervention and the infiltration plan. The memory still made him clench his fists. If House Bolton had chosen betrayal instead, the Starks would have lost everything. His father's legacy, the North's independence, gone. Now, ironically, the same House Bolton might play a role in finding Bran and Rickon. The realization was a sour reminder that fate had a twisted sense of humor. He turned to Sansa. You must be exhausted, sister. Why don't you rest? She shook her head. I prefer to stay here with you both. I want to help. A small, affectionate smile lifted Robb's lips. Very well. They continued studying the map for another hour, discussing each region, sharing memories that might offer clues. Sansa recalled a reedy pond near a weirwood grove where she and Bran once played, while Catelyn mentioned a clan of crannogmen near the neck that might have offered shelter. If the younger boys had wandered that far south, they might have encountered them. Eventually, weariness settled in. The hallways grew dark, and the wind's moaning rattled loose shutters. Maester Miles retired, promising to send fresh ravens in the morning. Catelyn ushered Sansa off to bed. Robb remained, leaning on the table with both hands, as the single lantern flickered. His mind drifted to a time before war, when they were all safe in Winterfell. He could almost hear Bran's laughter, echoing faintly in the corridors of memory. After a moment, he straightened, doused the lantern, and left the solar in darkness. Days blended into weeks, with winter storms lashing the countryside. The patrols sent by House Bolton, House Mormont, and other loyal families brought back little news of Bran and Rickon. A rumored sighting in a remote village turned out to be 2 orphans, shivering in a barn. Another sighting in the Wolfswood led only to footprints that vanished under fresh snow. Despite each disappointment, Catelyn held hope close to her heart, certain that if the children were out there, they would someday return. During that time, the North continued to mend. Lords oversaw the distribution of grain and salted meats. The king in the North's court handled disputes over land boundaries, inheritances, and petty crimes. Theon Greyjoy's confessions were transcribed by Maester Miles, in hopes they could glean strategic insights into Balon Greyjoy's plans. In the midst of that uneasy peace, an unexpected raven arrived bearing news from the south. Tywin Lannister had died, murdered on the privy by his own son, Tyrion, who had subsequently fled King's Landing. The shock of it rippled through the realm. Tywin had been the pillar that held the Iron Throne together for Joffrey, and now Tommen. With his death, the Lannisters might weaken from within. Robb convened his council to consider the implications. They met in the newly roofed portion of the Great Hall, a half-finished space with stacked supplies along the walls. A brazier burned near them, but the room was still chilly. Present were Roose Bolton, Greatjon Umber, Wyman Manderly, and several others. Catelyn stood behind Robb's seat, an unofficial advisor but a respected presence. Sansa hovered near the back, hands folded. So, Tywin is dead, Robb said, scanning the faces of the lords. And Tyrion is presumably in exile. That leaves Cersei and the boy King Tommen as the figureheads of House Lannister. We know how cunning Cersei can be, but Tywin was the true backbone. What does this end for us? Chaos in the south, Great John said, grinning. They'll tear each other apart, no doubt. Wyman Manderley nodded, though his expression was more cautious. Yes, but the Tyrells might step up to fill the void. Mace Tyrell fancies himself a power behind the throne. He could keep the Lannisters strong enough, especially if Cersei isn't foolish enough to alienate them. Roose Bolton spoke quietly. Even so, a shift in power might offer us the chance to bolster our position. Renew trade alliances with certain Riverland lords or Reach lords who might chafe under Lannister rule. We are now the king in the north, separate from the Iron Throne, but if the south fractures, we might strengthen our own autonomy. Robb inclined his head. Or they might see our independence as an opportunity to retake the north. If the Lannisters or Tyrells believe we're vulnerable, they might try to reassert the Iron Throne's authority. But for now, let them fight among themselves. We have no quarrel with Tommen, save that he sits where Joffrey once did. Great John harumphed. But we'll never bow to him. No, Robb agreed. We won't. For the moment, we hold to our truce. We won't march south and they won't march north. The moment they try, we stand ready. He let his gaze linger on each lord. Focus on our own matters for now. We have enough on our plate. Repairing our keeps, feeding our people, searching for my brothers, and preparing for any threat from beyond the wall. The council shifted to talk of local issues. A dispute over fishing rights along the White Knife, the distribution of building supplies from White Harbor, and patrols near the neck to keep an eye out for stray Lannister or Frey troops. The meeting wound down with a general sense of guarded optimism. If Tywin's death meant the Lannisters were in disarray, that could buy the North valuable time. After the lords departed, Robb found himself alone with Roose Bolton near the brazier's embers. The older lord had lingered behind, hands clasped lightly at his waist. "Your Grace," he said softly. "If the Lannisters are reeling, it might be prudent to secure new alliances. House Martell in Dorne is known to harbor grudges against the Lannisters. Or certain houses in the Stormlands might be swayed." Robb listened. "You think we should try to strengthen the North's position through new marriages or treaties?" "It might be wise," Roose said, "though we must tread carefully not to invite new entanglements that would bind us to southern wars. Still, an alliance could deter the Iron Throne from considering a renewed conquest. They'll be less likely to risk war with a North that has friends to the south." Robb considered it, his expression pensive. "I'll think on it, though I'd rather avoid more wedding feasts for the time being." He spoke wryly, remembering how the Frey wedding had nearly ended in blood. Even so, the notion of forging stronger alliances was practical. "If I may, Your Grace," Roose said, "you've proven your leadership in war and your capacity for mercy. The lords of the North respect you, but many hold you to your father's standard of honor. You wear a heavy crown and winter is here. Perhaps it's time we fortify ourselves in more ways than one." Robb nodded slowly. "I see your point. Thank you, Lord Bolton." With a final bow, Roose departed, leaving Robb to stand alone, his breath steaming in the chilly air. He glanced at the half-rebuilt rafters overhead, remembering how close they had come to never seeing these halls again. The next step lay ahead, uncertain but beckoning. Meanwhile, far to the north, the band of riders headed for the wall encountered bitter trials. Jorel Mormont and her companions struggled through snowdrifts taller than a man, forced to set up makeshift camps in ravines to shield themselves from howling winds. A few men suffered frostbite, their fingers turning numb and black. Ser Daemon Tallheart, the knight sent by House Bolton, proved capable in navigating the rugged terrain, though he was not the friendliest of sorts. He kept mostly to himself, quietly aiding in chopping firewood or setting up tents. One evening, they took shelter in an abandoned wooden tower built by rangers of the Night's Watch decades ago. The structure creaked ominously beneath the weight of heavy snow, but it stood well enough to block the worst of the wind. Inside, they lit a small fire, crouching around it for warmth. Embers glowed on their tired faces. Jorel Mormont sipped from a waterskin, spiked with a bit of strong northern spirit to keep out the chill. Her black hair, braided tight, was crusted with snow. "Never thought I'd see the day when the Mormonts marched south," then had to turn around and march north again in the same year, she muttered. This war has us running all over Westeros. Ser Daemon cracked a faint smile. At least we're not swinging swords at Lannisters for the moment. One of the Umber men, a grizzled ranger named Garth, nodded. I've had enough of southern battles, but I can't say this is better. If there truly are walking corpses up there, I'd almost rather face Lannisters again. A hush fell. Talk of White Walkers often brought that uneasy quiet. They had grown up with these stories. Pale figures, unholy eyes, the long night. But no living man had fought them in thousands of years, if they were even real. Still, the Night's Watch had sent ravens, and the king in the north believed enough to send them. So here they were, forging on. By the time dawn broke, the wind had lessened, and they set out again, forging across high ridges and frozen lakes. At last, after more days of punishing travel, they spotted the wall rising like a sheer cliff of ice on the horizon. Even from miles away, it dominated the skyline, a testament to ancient power, stretching east and west as far as the eye could see. Approaching Castle Black, they saw black-clad sentinels pacing the walls. A horn blast echoed across the icy fields, signaling strangers' arrival. Jarrell led the way, raising a hand in greeting. Snow swirled about them as they rode into the courtyard, where a knot of watchmen waited. Stepping forward was a tall man with a weathered face, wearing the black cloak of the Night's Watch. "Halt," he said, though not unkindly. "Who goes there?" "I am Jarrell Mormont, cousin to Jeor Mormont," she called, removing her hood. "We come from King Robb Stark of the North, bearing letters for your commander." The watchman, whose name was Bowen Marsh, blinked at the mention of King Robb. "We've heard rumors about that. A Stark on the throne again, is it? Well, we welcome you, or we would if we had the means. Times are grim, I'm afraid." She nodded, dismounting, and Ser Daemon Tallheart followed suit. "Then let us speak with the Lord Commander quickly. We've come a long way." Bowen Marsh's face creased with sorrow. "Lord Commander Mormont, he's gone." A chill, sharper than the winter wind, seemed to pass through the visitors. Jarrell's mouth opened in shock. "Gone? What do you mean?" "He was leading a great ranging beyond the wall. We received scattered ravens, reports of mutiny among his men, rumors of dead things attacking. There was talk that he was slain by his own. We don't know all the details, but he hasn't returned." Jarrell's heart sank. "Then who commands here?" "Maester Aemon for the moment. He's old and blind, but he's wise. We also have Ser Alliser Thorne acting in a leadership role and a few others. But the Watch is in disarray. We're losing men every day. Some deserted, others were killed by these things." Garth Umber whistled. "So the rumors are true?" Bowen Marsh nodded grimly. "Aye, or close enough. The dead rise in the far north, whites with blue eyes, commanded by these pale devils. We're trying to prepare, but we have too few men." He gestured toward the bleak courtyard. The place was underpopulated, the men that remained looking gaunt, haunted, and exhausted. "If you've come seeking truth, you'll find it here. The wildlings are also on the move, thousands of them, led by a man named Mance Rayder. He wants to breach the wall to flee the dead things." Jarrell exhaled slowly. She had braced herself for bad news, but this was worse than expected. "We carry letters for the Lord Commander from King Robb, and we're here to see if we can lend aid, or at least learn the truth to bring back to the north." Bowen Marsh nodded wearily. "Come then, I'll bring you to Maester Aemon. He'll want to see those letters." They led the visitors into the bowels of Castle Black, where torches sputtered in narrow corridors. The gloom of the place reminded Ser Daemon of the Dreadfort, cold stone halls that seemed older than memory. They eventually emerged into Maester Aemon's chamber, a cramped room lined with shelves of scrolls and potion jars. A small fire crackled in a brazier. Maester Aemon was a frail old man, his eyes milky white with blindness. He tilted his head as the group entered. "Who's there?" he inquired in a quavering voice. "Maester," Bowen Marsh said gently. "These are riders from King Robb Stark, come with letters and seeking information about the threat beyond the wall. Eamon's face wrinkled with a faint smile. So young Robb is a king now. Old Ned Stark's boy. How the world changes. He gestured for them to approach. Come, let me hear your tidings. Jorel Mormont stepped forward, carefully placing the packet of letters in Eamon's outstretched hands. I'm Jorel Mormont. Jeor Mormont was my cousin. I'm told he's fallen. Eamon's expression darkened. I fear it's so. The Lord Commander led a brave expedition, but they encountered horrors beyond imagining. An army of the dead, and men who turned on their own. We have few details, but none who went beyond the wall have returned, save a handful who speak of betrayal. It's a dark time for the Watch. Jorel bowed her head, trying to suppress a surge of grief. He was a great man, she said softly. He'll be remembered in the North. Eamon set the letters aside for the moment. If these letters are addressed to the Lord Commander, I suppose that task falls to the acting officers to read them. We'll do so soon. But tell me, have you come to aid us? The Watch is near breaking. The wildlings gather by the thousands, and the White Walkers ride the winds of the night. Ser Daemon cleared his throat. Our king is concerned by your ravens. He wants to know the truth of this threat before he commits men. You must understand, the North is rebuilding from a brutal war. If we muster an army and march it to the wall, we need to be certain it's necessary. Necessary? Eamon repeated, voice trembling with suppressed emotion. My good knight, if half of what I hear is true, it may already be too late. But we will do what we can to show you the truth. You'll meet our rangers, hear their testimonies, and perhaps you can then persuade your king to send help. Without it, the Watch may collapse, and then the realm is lost. Jorel and her companions exchanged wary looks. They had come expecting to investigate chilling rumors, not to find themselves at the heart of an impending cataclysm. But here it was, a broken watch, thousands of desperate wildlings, and an undead threat stirring in the frozen wastes. She nodded. We'll see what can be done, Maester. Good, he whispered, lifting the letters in his frail hands. We will read these together and respond as best we can. The memory of Eddard Stark lingers in these halls, and I sense his son means to honor that memory. You must see the threat for yourselves. While Jorel's party delved into Castle Black's grim secrets, word drifted back to Winterfell weeks later. Brief, coded messages that indicated trouble along the wall, though the ravens that arrived were few and uncertain, hampered by storms. Robb read them by torchlight, frowning at the references to thousands of wildlings on the march, the precarious leadership of the Watch, and the rumored roving dead. Catelyn saw the tightness in her son's jaw as he read one such raven's note, then set it aside. It sounds dire, she said, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders to ward off the chill. He nodded grimly. Yes, if the wall falls, we might all be in danger, not just the Watch, but to commit men to the far north in the heart of winter. He let the sentence trail. The North's resources were stretched, and an expedition to confront an enemy that many would dismiss as myth seemed reckless. Yet he couldn't shake the nagging dread that the warnings might be real. Maybe we can send a smaller force? Catelyn suggested gently. If the Watch truly needs help, we can't abandon them. Your father always taught us that the Night's Watch protects all the realms of men. Robb sighed. I know, but we have to weigh it carefully. Our people have suffered so much already. And with the Lannisters in disarray, I suspect they might still watch for any sign of weakness. If we strip the North of fighting men, we could be inviting disaster from the South. They fell silent, each lost in thought. Finally, Catelyn placed a reassuring hand on his arm. We will find a way. For now, we must see what Jorel's full report says. Then we can decide. If the threat is real, the North must rally. Robb bowed his head, remembering how Ned Stark had once prepared him for the responsibilities of leadership. This was no game. The decisions he made would shape the lives of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. He had survived a war that nearly cost him his crown, thanks in large part to House Bolton's timely loyalty. But now a new threat loomed. a threat that did not care about crowns or boundaries. "Very well, mother," he said. "We'll wait for more word from the watch, but keep the men vigilant. If we must ride north, we'll do it on short notice." Caitlin nodded. Snow fell steadily across the north, burying old roads and turning them into white wilderness. Scouts continued their searches for the missing Stark boys, but found no conclusive sign. Small folk in scattered hamlets reported sightings of direwolves, but none could say for certain if it was Summer or Shaggy Dog. Weeks turned into months. The illusions of calm that had followed the war's end slowly eroded in the face of rumors and foreboding. In the Dread Fort, Ramsay Snow conducted his own brand of patrols, capturing any Ironborn reavers he could find and subjecting them to harsh questioning. Some were turned over to the king's men, but others simply vanished in the dungeons. The peasants spoke of screams in the night, though none would say so publicly for fear of angering the bastard of Bolton. Lord Roose Bolton maintained a carefully cultivated image of order and loyalty, reporting to Winterfell as needed, presenting himself as the king in the North's dutiful bannerman. He counseled Robb on everything from trade routes to castle fortifications. The lords of the North grew used to seeing Bolton quietly at Robb's side during meetings, and as the realm waited for the next storm, be it from the south or the far north, an uneasy tension settled over the land. Then, late one night, the gates of Winterfell rumbled open in the midst of a blizzard. A tired and battered party of riders stumbled through, their horses half frozen, their cloaks caked with ice. At first, the guards did not recognize them, but then they heard the name Mormont called out. The riders were let inside. Robb was roused from bed, hastily pulling on a cloak, and rushed to the courtyard to greet them. Torches burned in a ring around the arrivals, revealing Jarell Mormont's weary face. Behind her, Ser Daemon Tallheart sat slumped in the saddle, an arrow wound in his shoulder. Others in the group looked likewise haggard and wounded. "What happened?" Robb demanded, moving forward. "Where did you come from?" Jarell slid off her horse, knees buckling. She braced herself and bowed her head. "Your Grace, the wall, the wildlings, it's worse than we feared." Robb signaled for Maester Miles and the stable hands. "Get them inside, get them warmed and fed. Then you'll tell me everything." Jarell shuddered, eyes distant with horror. "We saw them, Your Grace. The whites, dead men who walk. They came at us in the night, near the Shadow Tower. Some of our companions didn't make it. The Watch is fighting a war on two fronts. The wildlings seeking refuge and the undead that hunt them. The Watch begs for aid." A hush fell over the gathered men in the courtyard. Snow whipped around them, swirling over half-buried cobblestones. Robb stared at Jarell, trying to gauge the truth in her eyes. He saw raw terror there and something even deeper, an understanding that the stories were real. He swallowed. "You've done well to bring this news. Go inside now, recover. First light, I'll call a council. We must decide how to answer this threat." Jarell nodded, her lips trembling. "There's one more thing, Your Grace. The wildlings, their king, Mance Rayder, intends to cross the wall in force. If the Watch can't hold them, thousands will flood the north. They say they're running from the White Walkers. If the Watch falls, we face a double threat." Robb's blood ran cold. The worst scenarios he had feared were coming to pass. "We'll speak more in the morning," he repeated, gesturing for the maester to tend them. As the battered band was led away, Robb remained in the courtyard, snow clinging to his cloak. The wind moaned around him. He glanced up at the broken towers of Winterfell, half buried in drifts, and tried to fathom an invasion of wildlings in the midst of winter, chased by an army of the dead. Everything else, his precarious truce with the South, his search for Bran and Rickon, suddenly seemed overshadowed by this unimaginable menace. Caitlin approached, pulling her cloak tight, her expression grave. "I heard. Is it true, then?" Robb nodded. "It seems so. The dead walk, or so Jarell says, and the wildlings are on the move, not as raiders but as refugees." She laid a hand on his arm, her eyes brimming with concern. "What will you do?" He looked into the swirling snow, imagining the countless families in the North who had suffered from the war only to face something far worse. He thought of his father's words, "We must protect the realm, and the North stands as the realm's shield." Robb had never felt the weight of kingship more than he did in that moment. "In the morning," he said softly, "I'll summon the lords. We'll decide how many men we can spare to ride to the wall. But I fear it may require all of us." Caitlin exhaled a white cloud of breath. "Then the time for half measures has passed. We either stand with the watch or we watch all the living worlds fall." Robb set his jaw, determination sparking in his eyes. "We will stand," he vowed, "no matter the cost." The wind howled as though echoing his resolve, and the snowfall thickened, veiling the courtyard in a swirling curtain of white. Somewhere in the distant blackness of night, the hush of winter gave way to the faintest undertone of dread. But in Winterfell's battered heart, the king in the north resolved to meet the oncoming storm, bolstered by a realm that, unlike in another telling, had not been sundered by betrayal, but instead stood united, its bannermen prepared to face the darkest of nights together. That night, as Robb retreated to the great hall for warmth, he passed the old tapestry that depicted the Stark kings of old facing dire perils. He paused, running his fingers over the woven threads. In some ancient days, House Stark had fought back the long night, forging alliances with the children of the forest, or so the stories claimed. Perhaps that old spirit would guide them now. Outside, the snow fell heavier still, and in the shadows of a half-rebuilt tower, a quiet figure stood watching Roose Bolton, his face half-lit by torchlight, as though carved from ice. He gazed at the king's retreating form, pondering the ramifications of this new crisis. Where some men might see only terror, Roose saw possibility. If the North survived, it might emerge stronger, with House Bolton's influence further enhanced. If the dead truly came, no cunning scheme would matter, but if they could be beaten, it would be by a united North. He let the snow sting his cheeks, then slipped away into the darkness. The battle lines of a new war were being drawn, and this time, if House Bolton's loyalty continued to hold, the North might stand a chance against the creeping doom that threatened them all. And so, as winter deepened, the drums of war reverberated once more. Yet this war was unlike any that men had fought in living memory, for it was not a war of crowns, but a war of the living against the dead. And in that final hush of the night, with the wind wailing in the ramparts, the North prepared itself, forging steel and summoning courage, determined to stand or fall as one.